really warm welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming to this session. I'm just going to say a few words in opening. It feels very strange for me at a personal level that in 2024 we're talking about racism and education. Inequality and equity continue to be a defining feature in the higher education systems, in schools, in colleges, and in society. So today, it really does give me great privilege to be with a set of panellists who, for a decade and beyond, have been investigating some of these key areas. Today, we're going to focus on issues of race and education. We're going to look at the notion of labelling and the role that poverty plays in helping us address some of the biggest challenges that we find not just in the UK, but worldwide. So without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to Kalwant, who in her new book, Race and Education, Reproducing White Supremacy, is going to take us through some of the key findings and also acts as a challenge to the provocation of the debate. Kalwant, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Hello, everyone. So my book, Race and Education, Reproducing White Supremacy, was published in March 2024 by Penguin. It's a Pelican book. That's a plug there for the book, so it's available in all good bookshops, so go ahead and buy it. So one of the things I was particularly interested in this book was to examine whether after Black Lives Matter, whether this had a significant impact on how racial injustice was addressed, specifically in education. So the book explores different facets of education. It specifically focuses on schools, higher education, and policy making. So despite significant advances in policy making and despite the noise that was made specifically in higher education around addressing racial injustice, the book argues that in fact post-Black Lives Matter has made things worse in terms of understanding racial injustice. Racism continues to be perpetuated in schools and higher education, and it works in terms of understanding and oppressing people of colour. So what's key in the book is that post-BLM has made no significant difference to understanding the discourses and the narratives of racism. So I argue that education works complicitly to perpetuate a system of white privilege and white supremacy. That's the main summary of the book.
Okay, thank you. Jan, just picking up on some of the points that Kalwant so eloquently has just highlighted, particularly around white privilege. We've been talking about race and education. What role does poverty play in this context?
I think that poverty is the key to so many things in our society, including inclusivity. You can't be inclusive if a huge percentage of your population is struggling, and poverty and education go together. It is absolutely clear that early years education, even in leafy Oxfordshire, which is where I'm living at the moment, I'm part of an elite university, kids who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, they start their primary schools 5.5 months behind privileged counterparts. By the time they get to 16, they're nearly 2 years behind. That is just so deeply unfair. And we know that there's a strong correlation between kids who are of BME backgrounds and poverty. I co-chair something called the Oxfordshire Inclusive Economy Partnership, and what we're trying to do is to bridge that gap. It's clear that at Oxford itself, in the university, that kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, they find it much more difficult to get into Oxford for various reasons, which I can go into, and the same for kids who are black or Asian. That cannot be right, and so we've got to do something about that as a society. I'd like to come back on one thing that you said, if I may, about what happened post-Black Lives Matter. Something that Oxford University did was to set up a race equality task force, and I thought, oh my God, this is just going to be words, as it were. But it came out with 2 recommendations which are making a difference. One was to have a chief diversity officer who is really shifting the dial, and the other was to have because we live in a really strange place, Oxford. It's so complex, but it's a joint committee which is talking about diversity and trying to make a real difference. So I think that there are changes which are making a difference, and I'm not quite as pessimistic as you are.
Okay, so post Black Lives Matter, what was really interesting, and I've done some actual analysis on this, many universities went onto Twitter and said that our university does not tolerate racism. We will be fighting for racial justice. These were the same universities that had a black and minority ethnic awarding gap, which was bigger than the national average. These were the same universities that did not have one black professor that they had employed. So many of the changes that have taken place, and I'm not talking about Oxford because I don't know what the changes are, have been tokenistic and performative, and they work to benefit the white groups rather than to address racism that continues to perpetuate universities. And consequently, racism continues as business as usual.
So I want to just pick up on a couple of points before I bring Sathnam in. I'm really struck at the University of York, where we have done a considerable amount in really thinking about more deeply some of these issues. And in looking at the research, I'm really struck. So if I look at our black students, they come in with the same A-level grades, a whole set of experiences. We don't dumb down standards to let certain groups in and not others. And yet they are less likely to come out with a first than their white counterparts. Now that's an interesting thing in itself. So is it because they don't work hard enough? Is it that they just don't put their minds to the university life? Is the jump too great for them? As a sociologist, I would argue that isn't the case. So it must be something that we are doing kind of in the system. Now, why is that important? It's not just important for the lifetime they spend at university. There's a huge amount of debate about levelling up, levelling down, levelling out. What we then do is not just affect their life chances at university, we affect their life chances from there onwards. And so, Sathnam, I want to come back to you, particularly in relation to labels and labelling, because that's become yet another norm in terms of, rather than focusing on the issues, what do we label it?
Yeah, I mean, Rishi Sunak likes to put about the idea that because, he was elected or voted into as Prime Minister, somehow Britain doesn't have racism anymore. I'd just like to remind people that no one has voted for Rishi Sunak, that the Conservative Party elected Liz Truss before they elected Rishi Sunak, and also he's about to be evicted in a pretty profound way. So does that mean racism is back? It's nonsensical. Things have improved. I didn't think we'd ever have a brown Prime Minister, so it's amazing. But at the same time, Rishi and Suella and Kemi are standing in the way of addressing many of these issues. But what has changed, I think what someone like him in power does show is how meaningless a lot of the labels are now. Say for the phrase British Asian, what does that mean? That includes British Hindus, like Rishi Sunak, who are one of the most successful ethnic groups in Britain. I think something like 70% of British Hindus are in the professional class. But it also includes British Muslims, who are one of the least successful socio-economic groups in Britain. When last time I looked, about 15 years ago, something like a quarter of British Bangladeshis were taxi drivers. So what does the term British Asian mean? And in a way, these terms are failing because of our success. Because, certain Indians, I think British Sikhs like me do quite well. British Hindus do quite well, but there's absolutely groups that do not well, and especially in education, the traveller community, black groups, the almost complete absence of black professors that you just referred to. It's a real problem. But I think more profoundly in this country, we struggle with the idea that there might be any racism here, because our national narrative is that we are anti-racist, because we beat the evil racist Germans, we gave all these countries independence. How can we be racist? But actually, the truth is we ran a deeply racist empire for quite a long time. And also, we helped create modern racism. I mean, when racist science emerged in the 19th century, you had a real British flavor. British scientists were involved in that. And there's a deep legacy of that. But there's also a deep sense of denial which goes through every sector of British life, especially education.
Can I just, one second, Jan, can I just pick up that question of denial? Because, Kalwant, your new book is actually really instrumental in, again, bringing some of those challenges right to the forefront and actually not letting people off the hook by simply saying, oh, we've got an EDI lead, or it's part of the University Executive Board agenda. So talk to us more about the book and the research. What can we do? What should we be doing to bring about that change? And then, Jan, I'll kind of bring you in.
So one of the key findings of the book is what I call a hierarchy of oppression. So, for example, in higher education, we have EDI policies that are meant to tackle different types of inequality. But in effect, what they do is they create this hierarchy of oppression, whereby other inequalities, such as gender, for example, are always given privilege over race. Race always takes a backseat. There's never enough money for race. There's never enough time for race. There's never enough investment in race. So consequently, a hierarchy of oppression is created. And this is evident in policy making in higher education. But look, this is nothing new. Let's go back and look at feminism. Feminists were not concerned with the experiences of my mother. Feminism was concerned with the experiences of white middle-class women. So gender has always taken precedence over race in policy making and in other aspects of higher education. So policy making is really important because we have this performative element. So what happens is diversity is recognized, but oppression is ignored. And that's a fundamental key issue that I found in my book. And secondly, race is only addressed during particular historical moments. So firstly, I'm big enough and ugly enough to remember when race was addressed for the tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence, and we had the Race Relations Amendment Act, which gave us a definition of institutional racism. That was a significant historical moment. Race again has been addressed during another historical moment, which is the murder of George Floyd. So race is only addressed during particular historical moments. And what we have is within this hierarchy of oppression, race is silenced, it's re-silenced. Race is weaponized. We're always asked, or I'm always asked, how do you know it's racism? Where are you really from? Race is secondary. What about us? What about us, we're women? What about us, we're working class? So we have a hierarchy of oppression. Race has become a commodity. EDI policies and programs that I've just spoken about are bought and sold in a marketized neoliberal capitalist enterprise, which is the university. Race is declassed. So when we talk about the white working class, there's a failure to acknowledge that as you've just recognized, Sathnam, that Pakistani Bangladeshi groups perform the worst in education. They are more likely to live in poverty, and they are less likely to be in professional occupations. So when we talk about class, we only talk about the white working class. And race has been dealt with. Don't talk about that anymore. We live in a post-racial society. I argue that these changes are tokenistic. They are tick box, they are performative, and they work for the benefit of white groups to perpetuate a system of white supremacy. So racism in its forms of institutional, structural, and indeed individual acts of racism, our colleagues down the corridor, for instance, it's deliberately allowed to flourish, deliberately allowed to perpetuate a system that benefits whites to uphold this system of white supremacy. So of course I am pessimistic because I've been working in this area for 35 years, 30 years perhaps, and time again, we see very, very little change. And I would argue that the changes that we do see are very much performative.
Great, thank you. Jan, can I draw you back in again? I know you wanted to come back on a point that was raised earlier, but also, how does the intersection, Kalwant's just been talking about poverty being absolutely fundamental and instrumental debates on race and education. So your thoughts and reflections.
So, Stephen Lawrence Foundation says that education is the kind of key to tackling racism. I'm sure there's much more, but I do think that that education is fundamental. Therefore, when you have barriers to education, which is what poverty is, it is a barrier to education. We've got to do something in our society about poverty. Last year, 4.3 million children were living in poverty. That was up 100,000 from the year before. Apparently, I looked up the stats this morning, 47% of children in Asian and British Asian families are in poverty, and I recognise that there are different sorts of Asian, if you see what I mean. 53% of children in black, African, Caribbean and black British families living in poverty, and 25% of children in white families. Therefore, it's bound to be a real struggle to get those kids into education and to enable them to go from primary education, secondary education, and then into further education. And when they get into further and higher education, we've got to ensure that there are people there who are teaching them who are black, who are Asian. And at the moment, in Oxford, for example, there are 22% of statutory professors are women, 8% are BAME women. We've got to do something about it. I'm an optimist. I have to be an optimist. And therefore, I think that we've just got to make a difference. Legislation, that can make a difference. But it's also up to every institution and up to individuals in an institution to make a difference. We've all got voices sitting in this audience. It's up to us to make the arguments all the time and to try to make those in authority, in institutions and in legislation to make a difference.
Thank you. Thanks, Jan. Like you, I'm ever the optimist. But what do we do with that optimism so it translates into concrete actions? Kalwant has just talked about 30 years of researching, and the same things come up time and time and time again. So how do we move from talk to action? And if I could come back to you, because you talked more broadly about not just the issues that are in the context of education, but the deep historical roots that we have to work with and some of the kind of systemic issues that we often park to the side because they're quite complex, they're difficult. How do we have those conversations and change those conversations into concrete actions?
I think one very specific thing we can do is look at what we teach. We've talked about the Stephen Lawrence report. I think both of you mentioned that. Every couple of years in Britain, we have a massive racist or racism scandal. So Stephen Lawrence, Windrush, and there's an official report. Both the Stephen Lawrence report and the Windrush report talk about how we need to teach the history of empire, because that way there's going to be less racism. People will realize that we're a multicultural nation because we had a multicultural empire, and we have certain kinds of racism because empire was racist. But, I was looking this morning, apparently only 11% of GCSE modules studied refer to the presence of black people in British history. 11%. But, through my education, the first time I studied any brown or black person, the first time was in my third year at university. That was when I was allowed to read Salman Rushdie. I sat through dozens of Remembrance Day services at school, in a very racially diverse school. Not once did anyone mention that hundreds of thousands of Sikhs and people across India and Africa had fought in both world wars. And part of the ongoing problems with race in education have got to do with the fact that the curriculum doesn't recognize their existence. And it's been going on forever. And even though every single report mentions it, nothing seems to change, or it changes very, very slowly.
Great, thank you. Can I come back to you?
Yeah.
Because, you've done a huge amount of work in this area, and even at the University of York, we've been challenging. Do we simply decolonise the curriculum, and is that job done? Clearly it isn't.
So I think that there are things that we can do to make a difference, and one of them is decolonising the curriculum. But first of all, what does that even mean? It's a bit like, if we are thinking about decolonising the curriculum in universities, we need to really define what we're doing. It's a bit like the term intersectionality, which is often used as a buzzword, and nobody really understands what it means or how to use it. So we need to define what we mean when we say we're going to decolonise the curriculum. And that is, as you've said, rightly challenging imperial and colonial violence that has been a significant factor in terms of the UK.
I agree.
And
I think the word decolonising is terrible. 'Cause
Absolutely.
It creates the idea that you're just going to stop everyone from studying Shakespeare and Henry VIII. For me, it's better to use the word widening, because it's
Yeah.
about, you can carry on teaching Jane Austen and Shakespeare and Henry VIII and World War II. You just mention the imperial elements of all of those stories.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And my daughter did A-level English literature, and I think there wasn't even one author that was from a black or brown background. So I think we really need to think about what we are teaching our young people. And in some respects, when young people come to us in higher education, it's almost too late, because the foundation has already been set and they have specific understandings of what this notion of decolonisation means, particularly in relation to imperialism, colonialism, and the violence. I think it's also important to think about how all universities actually must invest in race equality schemes. Not universities where the Vice-Chancellor and Pro-Vice-Chancellor are interested in these particular issues. And I think the only way that this can happen if we have government legislation. Now, I say that with a very heavy heart, because I do not think that the next government, and we will have a different government, will actually invest in this. But, prove me wrong, let's wait and see. So all universities must invest in race equality schemes. It must be mandatory and not optional. And that must be investing in terms of financially and economically, and understanding what decolonial perspectives mean and how they actually play out. We must also, I would argue in my book, as I do, university-wide centres on understanding race. So we had Kemi Badenoch, a black woman who was then MP for Women in Equality, stand up in the House of Commons whilst she was debating Black History Month, which again is very problematic, but let's not go there, arguing that there is no such thing as white privilege, arguing that we cannot teach our children about critical race theory, okay? These are very dangerous words. So what I would argue that we need university-wide centres which specifically focus actually on white privilege and teaching critical race theory. And everybody should be taught about white privilege and critical race theory to understand the discursive nature of oppression in the UK. And one of the other things that we can do is to actually think about inclusive educational spaces in the UK. Now, my research has shown that in the US, historically black colleges and universities are very, very successful for black students. Why don't we think about investing in similar things in the UK? And we also need to invest in degree programs that specifically focus on black and brown histories. And I think if we have a holistic perspective, we can then move forward. So yes, we can have change, but this change cannot be tokenistic. It has to be strategic and result in significant differences. And finally, why is this important? This is important because education is a right and not a privilege.
Can I just say two additional things? One is clearly widening the curriculum is extraordinarily important. I really like the widening rather than decolonising. But there are two other things. One is when kids come to university, they've got to find a sense of belonging. It's not just what they're taught or what they learn, and that's really important, but they've got to feel that they can be who they are when they're at university or higher education, that they shouldn't have to change in order to fit in. They've got to be who they are, and they've got to feel that, the culture of the university is something that is welcoming, and so that they can feel at home and they can really, really flourish. I think that's important.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I think that whole point of inclusion, and Sathnam, I'm going to come back to you in a second. And actually what each of the panellists are saying in all their rich and diverse ways, individually we create change, but collectively we have to create a movement, a sustainable movement. And I was really struck, when we were talking about issues of poverty and the right to education. And I bet everyone in this room will have a backstory. Well, my backstory is I'm a kid who grew up in the back streets of the East End of London when the East End of London doesn't look like it does now. Kids like me didn't have that right to education. Kids like me were told nothing would ever become of us. and poverty was strife. So when I'm asked, did you have a privileged upbringing? I say, yeah. I grew up in one room with a family of brothers and sisters, and people say, how did you know you'd made it when we were allowed to have a bag of cheese and onion crisps and a can of 7-Up each? Now, those stories are powerful because experience in the way that you've articulated, Jan, about inclusivity. So we can get to those spaces, but how do we stay in those spaces? And you're quite right, Kalwant, when you argue that this isn't just the domains of senior leaders in institutions, it has to be everybody's business. So I often argue in the research that I've done, and particularly the work at the University of York, is that we are making inclusivity everybody's business, because only then can we begin to address some of the kind of systemic challenges that we are facing. But let me come back to you, Sathnam, because again, some of the things that we've been talking about are interlinked. By the time young people get to universities, in many ways, is often also too late. What about the bigger challenges and more widely in schools and society?
Yeah, I've got to say, I think we're agreeing too much. So if I can disagree slightly with what one thing Kalwant said, I disagree with. These racial equality schemes. I think if there's been one good thing about the backlash against BLM, the extraordinary backlash in politics, which has been toxic, one good thing has been the revelation that a lot of these schemes don't work. You know, they've been running, I wrote about them for 15 years as a journalist. I chaired a diversity charity, and I saw how they just don't change anything. And I think we need to rethink about and have a close look at the projects that do work. And from where I'm standing, you know, certain things work, like foundation years at Oxbridge are amazing. You could probably explain how they work. Basically, it gives people from maybe working class backgrounds, state school backgrounds, an extra year to prepare for a university education. And I think they worked really well in Oxford, the evidence I've seen. Creative Access, the charity that I used to chair, is now a social enterprise. And that takes on the fact that a lot of the professions, you know, are filled up with people who get work experience from their parents, you know, or take up work experience placements, which are only open to people who can have them unpaid, and they live in London. So I think that is where privilege just begets privilege. But I think we need to totally rethink the whole racial equality industry, because it's clearly failed.
Foundation years are fantastic. They enable kids from the most disadvantaged backgrounds to come to Oxford for that year, which enables them to understand the system, to have a more kind of holistic education. They've probably never been to the theatre, let alone, and it introduces them to their studies. Funnily enough, the vast majority of kids who come on a foundation year are from black, ethnic minority backgrounds. Hey, that says it all, doesn't it?
Yeah. And just building on that point, I'm really struck by some work that's been led by students. So much of the work we do to them and not with them. And at the University of York, the Black Access students, I mean, they're inspirational, and they are leading the generation of what education should look like in, you know, universities, because they're shaping it, they're designing it, and they are at the very table and the very heart of that. So almost breaking down notions of what leadership could look like and creating those kinds of inclusivity, you know, spaces, but not leaving the responsibility just to them. So now let me come back, and I'm just getting the panel kind of sort of ready for the questions that I know you will have in abundance. But before I do that, Kalwant, let me come back to you, because you've heard some of both the kind of agreements and then some of the challenges, and I know that your research will tell another compelling story.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have to think about, in terms of looking forwards, we do really have to think about the ways in which we define education, who it's for and what it's for. But one of the key issues that I talk about in the book is privilege, actually, and I argue once privileged, always privileged. So, you know, despite the fact that we do have some inroads in terms of understanding which type of students go to university, we still have a huge awarding gap, and it is black students, Pakistani and Bangladeshi students, who are less likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first. And last year was the first year where, in fact, the gap got worse. Every year it's been getting slightly better, but last year it got worse. So we need to do a lot if we are really serious about tackling racial injustice in higher education. And one of the things that I just really do want to say in terms of a piece of research that a student that I spoke to that has stayed in my mind, I spoke to a young Asian Pakistani student, and she disagreed with her lecturer about microaggressions, and he dismissed the term microaggressions and he laughed at her. And she handed in her essay, and she got, I think it was 65, and she was on track to get a first for that module. She compared it with her friend's essays, and her friends got 69 or 70. And then this student, she was graded in terms of her participation. She went to every seminar, she did every reading, and she participated in every seminar. And clearly she'd got the backup of this lecturer because he didn't agree with microaggressions, and he gave her 65. And one of her friends, who was a white middle-class young girl, barely went to any of the sessions and didn't do any of the readings, and she got 82%. Okay, so this is how the BME attainment gap works. This is how racism works in universities. Now, this poor student doesn't feel she can complain because the lecturer will say to her, well, actually, I gave you a 65%, which is really good, when in effect she should have got more. So it's those tiny little, well, not tiny, it's those examples and that systemic persistence of small acts of racism, which aren't actually small, which contribute to the attainment gap. And in the end, she didn't get her first, she got her a 2-1 because this module brought her grade down. So that's a really, really good example of how racism works. And the other thing that I want to say is that many lecturers that I have spoken to, and academics, white academics, not saying that they're racist, but institutional and structural racism gives white groups a get-out-of-jail-free card. Because what they say is, it's not me personally, I'm not racist, I don't do anything, it's the structures and the institutions that have to change. And one of the things that I look at in the book is the individual acts of racism that contribute to the example in the case study that I've just given you.
Great, thank you. Panellists, any further reflections and comments before I open it up to our audience? Yep, okay. We said today wasn't simply about talking at you, but talking with you. And so we really would like you to be part of the vibrant debate. So whether you agree, disagree, questions or reflections. Thank you. I knew this, okay, so I'm going to try and do it in a really systematic order. I'm going to start at the back of the room and work my way down. Take your hand down, but I'll ask you to hand them up, and I've noted the hands that are up. If you could just introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Asha. Thank you very much for a very pellucid discussion. My question to all the panelists is that there appears to be a huge demographic gap appearing between what we call as an indigenous population, if that term does exist, as opposed to the children of immigrant. And I see it at my workplace that you will see, because of the fertility rate going down immensely, there will be a case where you will need to rely on these people. And if we are not giving them the facilities, they're going to be a huge disaster. And the country will have to rely on overseas workers. But the point I really wanted to make was that I think where the racism emanates from, in my view, is primarily due to the lack of knowledge in amongst people, because they do not know their own history as to what makes Britain. Britain is a concatenation of various groups, the Celtics, the Anglo-Saxons, and they were not the true people. And as you know, that the Romans have been here for 350 years. And a lot of the soldiers they brought with them, they were mostly from the North African and the Mesopotamian and the Levant area, and they stayed on. So there's a lot of mishmash of blood DNA. So none of the people who are here. And then again, to re-emphasize the point of the malefic effects of the colonial, imperialism, the British imperialism. racism, not to sort of look at it in a very bad way, but just to bring the historic facts to the fore so everyone to know. And then I think this question of racism will, in my view, will just fade away.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to...
You're giving me that question?
I am.
My God.
And particularly because it leads so nicely into the book that you're going to
encompassed
present.
everything, the whole of existence. I'll just pick up on one point. I do think that if you're going to talk about race, we've got to get more sophisticated about it, and we do have to acknowledge the underperformance of white working class kids as well. We can do it. Just because the politicians like to create this idea that because white working class kids got underperforming, we then can't talk about race anymore. But actually, as we've talked about, brown and black people are disproportionately working class. You can talk about all of these things, but I think you've just got to get more sophisticated about your language and the issues you're talking about.
And let's make it absolutely clear, the white working class are not underperforming. Gypsy, Roma and traveller groups are underperforming, and Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups. And I didn't understand the question, so I'm sorry, I can't.
All right,
That again,
so-
we go back to the fact that the
Yeah.
word white encompasses all sorts of different groups,
Yeah.
and it's
I
kind
will-
of meaningless.
And I want to try and capture as many questions as I can. So I'm going to ask you to keep them as succinct as you can. I'm going to start at this end of the room, and then I'm going to work my way back. The lady with the lovely hat, thank you.
Thank you all so much. So much wisdom, so many important questions, and I hope this will really very much open things out. There are so many things I could comment on, but I'll just keep to one point of clarification. As a big fan of Sathnam Sanghera, I'd like to just gently encourage you to take a close look at the figures for the Indian soldiers in World War I, World War II. I believe you're significantly understating the contribution. I don't have the numbers to hand, but I think we'd be talking more like 1.5 million Indians in World War I and 1.5 million in World War II, that sort of ballpark. So their contribution was enormous, and they were so highly skilled, like a Sikh soldier, the skill, the courage, compared to, say, a British conscript. So like maybe 6 times as effective. So I think we should pay full tribute where these things, great sacrifices, great skill, great courage. And so
I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm sorry. Can we stick to the panel of what was discussed, please? Sorry to interrupt you, beg your
Well, I
pardon.
accept your point. They made a big contribution. I think I said hundreds of thousands. I
Yes.
meant millions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I want to go into the middle, and I'm going to the gentleman at the front there who had his hands up. Yes.
And if we could stick to the panel discussion, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hi, Ishan Akbar. So the question I have alludes to education. You alluded to it earlier that there's an issue of poverty in terms of access to education, but you mentioned we want more black professors, brown professors. To what extent do you think that the last 15 years of underfunding in our schools and universities prevents people from considering academia as a proper career choice? And do you think that that's something in terms of concrete actions you, the panel, and other people could take to try and ensure that there is an incentive for people to join this as an industry?
That's a really good question. Thank you very much. So, people that I've spoken to, young black and brown individuals, students doing PhDs, do not want to join academia. Higher education, actually education is in a state of crisis. We live in very fragile times, marred by social and economic and political instability. So I think we need to be very careful in terms of where we move in terms of funding for education. And we are going to have a new government on July the 5th, I think. And I think it depends what they will invest. If I was doing my PhD now, I would not want to become an academic, absolutely not. But I think about what Derek Bell, who founded critical race theory, what he would say, and he would say that it's really important to have people who are fighting for racial justice to continue to have the conversation, and that's why I'm here today, because I think we have to keep talking about racial injustice, and we have to keep working on it, because if we fail to do that, then I think, well, we've lost. So I do encourage my PhD students to come into academia, but also outline those risks associated with that. And who knows, you know, it might get better with the next government. There may be more funding in schools that are deprived. There may be more funding and universities may not close down. So let's be optimistic.
And I'd say, as one of the first female pro-vice chancellors of colour from, you know, an Indian background, and building on what you say, Jan, and ever the optimism is, I believe in moments of crisis, that's when we have to create an environment for more inclusive roles and more inclusive education, and support people to want to have careers in education by not making it even more difficult. Because without that, then how will we ever be part of a system that kind of changes? Jan, I know you wanted to come in.
I agree completely. There's a funding crisis, complete funding crisis in higher education. The whole system just doesn't work. And it's hell for people who want to do PhDs and then become early career researchers. There are some really interesting reviews taking place at the moment. There's one project called Generation Delta, which one of my colleagues, a black professor, is involved in. And it's talking to young women especially who might be thinking about doing PhDs and going on to higher education. And yes, it's to do with funding, but it's also to do with discrimination, it's to do with confidence, it's to do with so much more. And I really look forward to their report, which I hope will make a tangible difference. But we've just got to keep encouraging people to go into education, because that is the way to transform lives.
Great, thank you. I want to take some questions from the front, and then I'm going to work my way back up again. I'll take both, and then we'll see how we manage them.
Hello. Thank you so much for your panel. Super interesting. I thought the comment you made about voices being silenced by the time you get to university was really interesting. When I went to school, I went to a very nice independent school. I was like one of 3 Asian kids in my year. But I learnt nothing about my own history. I went to university and I studied politics, learnt nothing, maybe a little bit about some Indian people, maybe. But my question is how do you rectify that going forward? So for me, going into my 30s, I had no idea about my identity, where I come from, my family. I'm a first generation. How do we fix that for the next generation? Because that identity is a strength that we bring to leadership positions. So yeah, that's my question.
Thank you. And just hold 5, panel. That's a great question. Let me take this one.
My question is very short and succinct. How important is it for us to use terms like white privilege and white supremacy, given that they have become political footballs, and move away from the word diversity, which is sort of a catch-all and means nothing at all?
Great, thank you. 2 really important, critical. Kalwant, if I come to you first, and then the one about labels again, if I could come back to you. Thank you.
So in terms of that's again a really, really good question. I think it's really, really important to understand how our experiences affect our identity. So young people that I've spoken to who are British Indians, their heritage is British Indians, are very confused about their identity, even though they are, for instance, not mixed heritage, because I've spoken to mixed heritage young people as well. And I think that, again, it takes me back to, we have to take 3 steps back almost and think about primary education, secondary education, and like I've already said, in some respects when students come to us at HE, it's almost too late, because those foundational elements of what culture is, what multiculturalism is, what decolonisation is has already been actually set. So I think, in some respects, we have to redo the work at higher education. So in some sense, we need to think about the whole education system. Who is teaching, what they're teaching, and how they're teaching it. So I went up and down the country and I spoke to young people in schools post-BLM who experienced racism. So on the one hand, their white friends were quite confident to put on their Snapchat stories and Instagram, #BLM. But within the classroom and the playground, they thought it was okay to use the N-word and the P-word. And these schools dismissed this behaviour as banter. It's teenagers being teenagers. It's not racism. So if that's going on in our schools post-BLM, I think we need to really think about how we're training our teachers to A, acknowledge racism, and B, to address it. Because a failure to acknowledge racism results in a failure to act upon it.
Thank you.
I'm going to dodge that second question
Okay.
because I don't want to end up in the Daily Mail. But I'm going to answer your question. I'm quite a miserable person. It goes against my nature to say anything optimistic, but I'm going to say something optimistic. My experience of having written about empire now for 5 years is there's massive change happening in schools. The national curriculum is still crap, but academies don't have to follow the national curriculum. Private schools don't have to follow the national curriculum. The Welsh national curriculum has already changed to reflect empire and slavery and the issues you talked about. The Scottish curriculum will probably change soon. And my experience from going around talking to schools, that individual history teachers and other kinds of teachers are trying to make change. So the national curriculum doesn't have the hold over the national childhood psyche that he once did. And what I see is huge change. And I suspect it's going to accelerate when Rishi is RIP soon.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to this corner of the room. And again, I'm going to take a couple of questions. So I can see just in the back. Thank you.
Thank you. A little bit of a challenge to Kalwant Singh, but a friendly one, because I immensely admire the work that you're doing. But I wonder if, and also, if one agreed with you about, say, the critique of neoliberalism in universities and so on, one wouldn't necessarily want to require everybody else to agree with an essentially anti-capitalist critique in order to admit that they can take part in this necessary debate about how we widen the curriculum, how we root out racism. Are we not at risk of being exclusive and antagonistic towards people we need to be bringing on board if we're insisting on this language?
No, absolutely not. I think we should tell it like it is. I think we should be, if racism is racism, I think we should say it's racism. I think we've had years and years of pussyfooting around and saying, well, actually, it's not really racism, it's discrimination, it's oppression. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Do you want to get the microphone?
Oh, bless you.
You
referred to the universities being neoliberal institutions and so on. I mean, must we insist on ideological conformity to be from people who, in order to engage in the debate with us?
Universities, in my opinion, and it's great that I love it when people disagree with me, universities are neoliberal institutions. They are capitalist enterprises. So, yeah, I'm going to say they are. I'm not really sure what your question is.
Okay, so I want to try and cap as many questions as I can, so I hope that gives you some response. The guy with the pink band on, navy shirt, thank you. And I'm coming back to this side of the room.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. I think this has been touched on a bit, but I wanted to delve into maybe the detail, the minutiae of this point, because it seems to me it's obviously very important that more people of colour, more people from disadvantaged backgrounds go into higher education. But I think that the thing with that is it leaves a lot of the structures in place, like whether they be, racial disadvantage, socioeconomic disadvantage, all the rest of it. These structures of oppression stay in place. And so I wonder, I think it was said that we need to have a more sophisticated conversation about race, and I want to know how that actually works, or how we make our cultural consciousness and the conversation that we collectively have more sophisticated. So whether that's more like better primary education, or how you change the concepts that are used just in normal conversation, because often the sorts of concepts that we're talking about get stuck in a particular band of people that have a certain investment of cultural capital, but then you leave structural racism, structural oppression in place, I think, unless you're able to have a broader dissemination of how you attack and change the point's been made a few times, quite rightly, baked in ideas into our national consciousness of what's right and good and what isn't.
I will leave you to answer in detail, but one thing is that the more people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds and from disadvantaged backgrounds that go into higher education, that, go into careers which are influential, that's going to bring about change. The more black and people of Asian origin who are teachers, I hope that they are going to bring about change. The same in higher education. The thing about Oxbridge, and I come from this elite education institution, is that rightly or wrongly, they produce leaders of our country, be it in politics, in business, and education, okay? But if we can have more people who come from different backgrounds who are going on to be leaders, that is one way of bringing about change. Not the only way, but is a way of bringing about change.
Sorry, just really important on that. The reason for my question is that I'm pessimistic about that. I went to Cambridge, I'm a lawyer. I can see people in these spaces who come from different, like, socioeconomic backgrounds. I come from a disadvantaged socioeconomic background, and then actually creating change once you're in those places, it's very, very hard. There's this pressure to conform, actually, and behave, because now you've been let into the hallowed spaces that are typically these vectors, places that give you a vector of power. You're then not encouraged, not often disincentivized from trying to change those spaces. So this is what I mean. Like, sure, I take your point, but I think there has to be a broader efforts as well.
Yeah,
I'm also going to say unity is strength. So the more people that are out there, the more people have courage to bring about change. That makes a difference.
And I think you raise an important one, and I can speak again from my own experience. You're absolutely right. It's paradoxical because you sometimes end up not wanting to be the custodian of the status quo and the change maker and change shaper. But you also want to have this sense of, I belong and I'm not different, and finding your voice within the context of that. And I think that's a really powerful insight and thing that we've really got to kind of think about, so that we don't end up leaving those positions to go back to spaces where we feel, our voices can be heard. So the question I often ask myself, where can I do my best work? As Pro-Vice-Chancellor, or in different parts of the institution to create that change, And so leadership of the future has to look different, has to feel different, and has to act differently.
So I would say that I agree with what you're saying, that what happens is we have these, what I call gestures, and they're dances, a toing and a froing and a pretense. And so we have these tokenistic measures that take place in higher education. These are performative, and they work for the benefit of the universities rather than the groups to which they are aimed. So, for example, universities, of course, they're going to invest in the Race Equality Charter because they can sell themselves as diverse and fair with social justice at the heart of their agendas. But they do nothing to change the day-to-day racism and the structures and the institutions. So I actually agree with you. Structural and institutional racism is allowed to, and individual racism actually, is allowed to flourish because we have this window dressing and this showcasing that, look at us, we're doing something different, when in fact it's a tick box and tokenistic exercise. So I don't know, I don't think I've answered your question. I've agreed with you, and I don't know how to answer your question in terms of moving forward.
Great, thank you.
That was a really good question, thank you.
I want to move to, and I'm going to again take a couple of questions. So the lady at the front first.
Hello, hi. So thank you for your talk. I'm a teacher and I work for Teach First at the moment, which is this organization which believes in helping educational inequality. You end up getting teacher training in the more disadvantaged schools of this country. And I think it's been a real wake-up call for me being in some of the most disadvantaged state schools, academies in this country. I think when I was in education, I had the same ideals of decolonizing the curriculum, et cetera, and then when you become a classroom teacher, you really realize the extent to which education is in crisis. Currently at my school, which ranges from year 7 to year 11, the pass rate is about 40% for GCSEs in the school, of all pupils in this school. There is pretty much almost no child who would get the GCSE results needed to do A-levels and then go to any Russell Group university at all. And I've seen very talented, in terms of their abilities, students completely let down. And then I thought, let me do some more research on it. Ofsted has written a report on how the most able students in the majority of state comprehensive schools basically never get the grades to get to Russell Group universities at all. Obviously, this is a class issue as well as a race issue. And it made me realize my own educational privilege, the fact that also went to top universities like UCL and Cambridge, that at the end of the day, you don't see a single person who really went to these schools that are in positions of power discussing these things. I did not know that education was this poor in this country until I went. I went to a state primary school, private school for 5 years, sixth form college. And it's just a real, and I thought meritocracy really existed. I really did, very naively, and then I realized it really, really doesn't. So in some ways, yeah, higher education is trying to redeem some of the issues, but I think the issues are really at the core of the neoliberal system that we have throughout this country. I do wonder if that system has changed. I feel like, you were quoting earlier, it's something that we quote a lot in Teach First, that these kids, the GCSE, I was in an exam hall on Friday looking at these kids, hundreds in the exam hall thinking about 40% of you are going to pass this GCSE science exam. What are you going to do after? There's a number of reasons. Behavior is a big reason. Parents not buying into education is another reason. Teachers not believing in it. All of these problems, but it is a nationwide problem. Currently, 25% of kids in England don't even pass their GCSEs. The levels of literacy are very, very low. So it becomes very difficult to talk about these really great ideals of decolonizing the curriculum when the basics aren't being met. So I just wonder, how can higher education, what are your suggestions for really meeting these basics that are needed at the end of the day? Because we can't speak of getting working class kids from ethnic minority backgrounds in when they can't even get the GCSE grades. And they're very capable kids, but they're just let to the wayside because they're not from those privileged backgrounds to go get into grammar schools, get to private schools, get to good schools at the end of the day.
Thank you. Thank you for such a powerful insight, powerful debate.
I think it's a travesty what's happened to education in this country, from primary school education onwards. It also starts with early years. We know now there's empirical evidence at Sure Start, for example, that made a real difference to kids going to primary school and how they were going to advance in the system. We've got to have more investment in primary schools and in secondary schools. We've got to realise how important the jobs are of teachers and really respect teachers, ensure they've got proper training and support them and put more money into our education system. Otherwise, it ain't going to change.
Thank you. I've got time for one more question, and then I want to hand it back to the panel for their concluding reflections. This is going to be a hard choice, isn't it? So I'm going to go because I know that you put your hand up at the very start.
Choose the best looking one.
No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do it in terms of fairness and equity. Thank you.
Hi, I've really enjoyed listening to all the conversations. I am primary trained teacher and I'm currently doing some research I'm doing a master's now into how we can disrupt dominant whiteness in the curriculum in monocultural areas. And what I found when I've gone to try and read around it is the conversation is very much based on tertiary and secondary education. There's very little going on in the primary and there's nothing in nursery. And I just wondered, how can we involve the primary sector? Because I agree that when you get to tertiary, it's too late. You can't do the work you need to do. You can't have the impact that you want to have. So how can we really get to grips with this at primary and nursery level in a way that can really help?
Thank you. Kalwant, if I come to you first and then Jan.
So I think it really does go back to funding. And I think that many primary schools and nurseries are underfunded, as are secondary schools and higher education. So I think we need initiatives and policies and strategies where the government will invest through funding in terms of understanding what kids are taught at nursery and primary school. And I think that has to be changed significantly. And I think we also need to look at the labour market in terms of teaching. So I think about 90%, 95% of teachers are white and female. Head teachers are more likely to be white and male. So our teaching workforce is predominantly white. So I think we need to look at more funding, thinking about what we're teaching in terms of the curriculum and also the workforce.
I think teacher training is key as well, but that puts a huge burden on teachers. And you've already got enough burdens, have you not, all the teachers in the room? So it's finding a way forward that enables part of teacher training to incorporate issues to do with widening the curriculum, with racism, that people are aware of, aware of what's happening in the world around them, and to try and make those kids from the very beginning grow up with an awareness of what is happening around them and not to be racist, and so we don't have to be having this conversation in 10 years' time.
Also, it doesn't help that almost all the cabinet went to private school, and we've had about 50 education ministers. There's no consistency. There's no serious efforts to change things, and people aren't invested in it as much as they should be.
Great, thank you. Our time is up. Can I just say a huge thank you to the audience first for your engagement, for your provocation, and for your questions and giving up your time here. And then to the panellists for their thought-provoking challenges. But I hope that we leave you with a little bit of hope, as well as the challenges that we have ahead of you. And the University of York for sponsoring the session. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.